I'm going to try to rush through here because we're very short on time, and take you through a lot of information very, very quickly. So fasten your seatbelts. This is going to go pretty darn fast. And you're going to see a lot of overlap with things that have already been talked about by other speakers. I think the good take-home message is that there's a convergence of thinking going on right now. We may not have all the answers, but at least we're identifying the problems together in a similar way. Okay, that didn't work. Let's try that. There we go. We're having elections, in case you didn't know, and the expectations overseas related to these elections are absolutely disproportionate to any possibility to deliver. And the biggest expectation is that we're going to have a new foreign policy, we're going to be engaged in the world, we're going to care about the rest of the world, and we're going to get engaged especially in Africa, where the hopes for what Obama can deliver are way beyond any reality. In fact, a lot of money has poured into Africa over the last 50 years, but Africa's role in the world economy has actually declined markedly over the very time when there's been so much foreign assistance pouring into the continent. That's a total tragedy, and it means we've been doing things wrong. We have not approached it the right way. About 10 years ago, the wealthy world, and in particular a lot of advocates and activists, realized it was time to do something new. And they were propelled a lot by HIV and by the SARS epidemic to think about how to put a new kind of money into Africa and to the rest of the developing world, oriented in a new kind of way. But all of that is threatened with reversal right now because of the global economic catastrophe and a number of political changes. Our number one challenge was HIV, which emerged in the early 1980s at a time of great denial. The world community refused to see it as a global responsibility, and by the time we really had engagement from the global community, we had a massive death toll, millions dead, tens of millions infected, and a huge burden of orphaning, with an entire generation growing up without parental guidance, without someone to take them to that barefoot college and make sure they get the right kind of education in life. And so we allowed this epidemic to have catastrophic impacts, with now a whole generation of children being raised by their grandmothers because their parents have died. Another challenge is that we haven't set the right targets. The key target ought to be related to this hideous differential in life expectancy of societies. The richest societies and the poorest societies of the world. It's unprecedented, it's growing at a rapid pace, and it represents a 48-year differential between the longest and shortest lived societies in the world. That should be our target. That's immoral. That's absolutely hideous. And it is doable to shrink that without making the longest live less long. But look at this. In the middle of the 20th century, the rich world was living 66 years. Today, the poor world is still not living as long as the rich world was half a century ago. We have a long ways to go. We have to set the targets right. Now, the UN system sat down and made up their targets. They call them the Millennium Development Goals. There's 8 of them. They're not the greatest, but okay, we have to live with it. The problem is the target date is 2015, and we still don't have any money to try and achieve these targets. In fact, aid is declining dramatically. The global picture is the money's not flowing. The G8 keeps making commitments. They're short on actually fulfilling $21 billion worth of commitments. We're running out of time. Can we manage to hit these targets? Well, they're interesting targets. 4 of them directly affect human health, and the one we're doing the worst on is maternal survival. Women dying in pregnancy-related complications. In fact, the differential is logarithmic in the world. Sweden, a woman's chances of dying in childbirth, 1 out of 30,000. The United States, 10-fold worse. But you get down to Afghanistan, Liberia, Sierra Leone, you're at the 1 out of 6 to 1 out of 10 level. Hideous probability that a woman will die in childbirth, and that these girls will grow up, give birth, and die immediately afterwards. So, one message to the new president is, do you want the MDGs to all fail miserably on your watch? And if you don't, you have to start really shoving money into them right now. Now, the other challenge is we don't have healthcare workers. In fact, we're all over the world. We have no infrastructure that really can meet health challenges, and we have grossly insufficient numbers, about 4.3 million short on healthcare workers. The deficit is to the tune of 2.4 million acutely, meaning people are dying for lack of those healthcare workers. And then the system is not resilient. We saw that when food prices shot up in January, 300% increase overall in essential grains, and rice in particular, partly because those people that Juan was talking about yesterday were manipulating the food commodities market. And even Zolik, the head of the World Bank, has said this is the major catastrophe of our time. We're looking at something in the neighborhood of 100 million people pushed into starvation just since January, and about 1 billion people forced to cut back on the number of calories they're consuming every day. I've seen it myself in Bangladesh and throughout Africa. People literally cutting back on how much protein they consume because the prices are so high. Add in a catastrophe storm, climate change impact, and you have the perfect storm. Even in the cyclone in Myanmar, we saw the other problem. People might have survived, but they got wounds that turned out to have drug-resistant bacterial infections. This is the other challenge. The black market use and inappropriate use of antibiotics all over the world is driving the emergence of drug-resistant bacterial infections. At a huge pace here in the United States, it's our probably #1 public health catastrophe right now. Overseas, the big problem is extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, and vancomycin-insensitive Staph aureus. These infections are essentially incurable once you get them, unless you're in really extraordinary circumstances. And that XDR-TB only was noted 4 years ago, and it's now all over the world. The other problem, of course, is money. We're spending about $20 billion a year for global health efforts. And the portion that comes out of our budget, called the 150 account in the US budget, has increased steadily. Looks like huge increased commitments over time by the United States of America. Aren't we generous? In fact, a 740% increase since 1965. 240% of that occurred during the years of, yes, George Bush. And a big piece of that was for the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which has put almost 2 million people on antiretroviral therapy to treat their HIV infections in 15 key targeted countries, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa. Looks like fabulous success. Looks like we should be very proud as American people for our achievements. But actually, when you break this down and look at that money, in 1962, during the Kennedy administration, 3% of the US budget went to foreign assistance, and today it's 0.5%. And likely to be cut. Even Joe Biden said on the campaign trail, well, because of this economic crisis, we'll probably have to cut foreign assistance. You know what happens if you cut foreign assistance? People die. The other challenge that we're facing is that land is disappearing. We've already heard about this in some of the prior conversations for a lot of obvious reasons, but this means less and less arable farmland to produce food. And at a time when food prices are skyrocketing, the only way to offset that is to improve production. But everywhere in the world, the quality of cropland and the available cropland is just disappearing before our eyes. Partly because of overuse, partly because we're running out of water, a whole host of reasons. And water, of course, is an enormous challenge. It takes a lot more water to raise a cow than to grow several bushels of wheat. Our priorities in our water use are completely out of kilter, and most of the world is still struggling to have safe drinking water every single day. And here we want bottled water. Idiotic. And the reasons we want to pay more per drop for water than we do for gasoline are because we don't think our tap water, which we already paid for with our tax dollars, is safe. What kind of idiots are we? And there's absolutely no difference between this. This is tap water. This is tap water. Meanwhile, this is water for most of the world. We're paying an insane amount of money to walk around with these plastic bottles. I hate seeing them here. You people should know better, because you know where they're all going to end up. Right here. And what does that do? Contribute to the CO2 footprint for every single person in the room. Stop with the bottled water. Meanwhile, against the background, one of the things we haven't talked about much here is the massive growth of population, all of which puts more pressure on every one of these issues. Now, the good news is, in India, where Mr. Roy is from, more and more of the population is entering the middle class. That's fantastic. Same in China, same in Indonesia. That means that they're consuming more calories, and in particular, they want more protein. That's right, too. They should. But that means that the production scale and the nature of production has to massively change from what it is now, or we're never going to feed all those mouths. More amazingly is the shift towards the high probability that when you grow lots of animals together, you increase the probability of zoonotic diseases, viruses that jump from one species to another because of the way we're concentrating species around the world, meanwhile devastating the native habitats that those remote animals might have lived in. Along with the eating habits, these were out of order. You could see the massive difference in the Chinese diet that has occurred in a very short amount of time, 17 years. And this is occurring all over the world with prosperity. On top of it all, we're more mobile. All of you took airplanes. That means we have microbial hitchhikers traveling with us all over the world. As where we go, they go, and that means no disease is so remote that it can't be in your backyard tomorrow. This is shifting radically. So the example I want to give you is SARS, which started here in Guangzhou. I was in this marketplace. This actually is multiply this aisle by hundreds in both directions, each a specialty aisle selling a different live type of animal for human consumption. Because the Cantonese like a very exotic diet. You might want snakes to have for dinner tonight. You might want reindeer or some kind of antelope. You may be interested in raccoon cats or civets. And the civets, it turned out, were very susceptible to this new virus that we now know came originally from rainforest bats. And the civets became the carriers, which passed it on to the humans as they handled them like this, as they skinned them, as they prepared them in restaurants and served them. Now, one individual, this was covered up by the Chinese government, one individual fled Guangzhou, infected, to Hong Kong, and booked himself into this hotel, the Metropole. For reasons we don't fully understand, 12 other people on his floor got infected and then went to Singapore, Toronto, Hanoi, Beijing, and a host of other locations, taking SARS with them. So it globalized like that. All the while, we didn't know it existed until suddenly in Hong Kong, people became terrified. And it transformed the entire city of Hong Kong. Everywhere I went, people looked like this. And it wasn't until April 20th that Beijing admitted, April 20th, 2003, that there was an epidemic, that it was in Beijing, that they had indeed been covering it up. And all of a sudden, everything in China changed. I've never seen anything like it, and I hope I never do again. First of all, 250,000 people fled the city within 24 hours. Fled via mostly the trains. Text messaging, rumors, wildly out of control, were telling students and migrant workers that the government was going to use the epidemic to declare martial law and lock them all down. So they fled as soon as they could and took the virus with them all over China. Tourism came to a full stop, and most of the economy came to a stop. And so places where normally you would see millions of people jammed, like the Great Wall or the Forbidden City, were utterly empty. By the way, I enjoyed it very much. And those that did venture outside wore masks, 2 masks, 3 masks, 4 masks, however many they could find. And there was definitely a sense of fear everywhere, pervasive in the air. Once the Chinese government realized the situation was out of control, they tried to issue a lockdown. To this day, China will insist they never place the capital city under quarantine, but you could not get out of the city. Part of the reason was their laboratory capacity was very poor. They had no real tradition of epidemiology. They couldn't do case control studies. They couldn't do the kinds of techniques we might use in such an epidemic to identify who the carriers were. So what did they do? Well, they built a massive 1,600-bed isolation quarantine hospital with its own sewer system, its own electrical system, its own air system in 6 days. 6 days. The workers work 24/7, and each of these is a quarantine airlock room. And then they were staffed by the People's Liberation Army physicians. They went out all over Beijing. Every household that was known to have had a SARS case was placed under quarantine. The individuals were removed and put in that hospital. And the households remained under quarantine for several weeks to just make sure that SARS didn't somehow float around. Then they really did lock Beijing down. And every single transit site was staffed by the military and public health officials. Everybody was getting fever checked with these little temperature guns. As you tried to leave the city, you would find out that you couldn't get out. Sorry, you cannot leave Beijing. There were escape routes. I did take a couple, but it was tough. Then they repeated the exact same thing nationwide, because in fact, they had so failed to control the epidemic that they had to assume that more than 1 billion people were potentially infected. At the village level, the people set up their own quarantines because they said one night's hospitalization for we peasants is a year's income. We don't trust the doctors. We don't trust the nurses. They steal from us. So even though it's going to hurt us economically, we're cutting off our own communities from the rest of the world. Nobody can come in. We have to keep the virus out. Does this sound like the Middle Ages? What China ended up doing was replicating this and deciding, well, maybe the villagers have a good idea. So at villages all over, the same process was repeated. Their own little barricade lines, their own little quarantine set up, so that nobody would come in, nobody would bring the virus. And then out on the highways, try to imagine this in America. Try telling the Teamsters, as you drive across America with cargo, every 10 miles, you will be stopped. Your vehicle will be sprayed with disinfectant. You will have to get out of your vehicle, register by name, show identification, get a fever check. And if you have a fever, you have no civil liberties whatsoever. We hustle you off with the military, and you go into one of these new isolation hospitals. End of story. This was what they had to do to control their epidemic. Imagine trying to replicate this in the United States. Impossible. In fact, we don't really know what we would do, although every model study with leading politicians has shown that they all try to shut borders down between Oklahoma and Texas, between California and Arizona, and to somehow keep viruses out, which is insane. Absolutely won't work, will cost a bloody fortune, and will only succeed in creating great tensions and breaking down all solidarity between American people. But across China, this was the method, this is what it took to stop the epidemic. And if there's one thing the Communist Party is good at, it's mass mobilization. Then, to please the international community and get the tourists to come back, they went around scrubbing all the Forbidden City and all of the Summer Palace and so on, and then boom, in June, it's over. And they tell the people of China, victory is ours. What did Hong Kong learn from that? Well, the main thing was Hong Kong said, we don't have appropriate infection control, and we don't have the right kind of containment facilities with respirator units. They have built 1,400 of the best containment facilities and hospitals anywhere in the world, where no city in the United States can come close. I think New York has only a couple of hundred, if that. And the United States, most of the country has none of these. They also put in these marvelous little hand wash stations where you would disinfect your hands. They were in all the subways, all the shopping malls, all over the entire Hong Kong, every place you went, so that people were constantly, somewhat obsessively, washing their hands. In the hospitals, they were reminding people, when you remove, a doctor or nurse remove your contact lenses, if your hands aren't clean, you're going to get SARS. Be careful with everything you do. Wear the right barrier protection, because it turned out that was the key to how SARS was spreading inside hospitals, on hands, between people as they removed their equipment and their gloves. Reminding all the families that when you leave the hospital, wash your hands. Don't go out and infect the community. All right, so what could we do? Well, let's see how well we did when our own catastrophe hit. Katrina. This was a rude awakening for all of America to realize just how messed up we were. Not just the racism of seeing black faces pleading for their lives, but the fact that our infrastructure completely, utterly failed. There is no way we were ready, and the White House freaked out. The National Security Council freaked out. I was in these meetings and they said, what's next? I said, have you thought of pandemics? Have you thought about the lesson of SARS? Have you considered whether or not America is ready if there's a real flu pandemic, akin to what happened in 1918 when we warehoused thousands of patients and lost 100 million people in 18 months worldwide? Well, if you're going to prepare for that, let's do sustainable change. And a few key things that I think the next president should consider. Almost none of our foreign assistance is linked effectively with innovation and research. We can do things better, but we need to do them on the ground and learn as we go. If you're going to invest billions, let's learn with those billions. Let's make each step of foreign assistance a better step than the one we took last year, or last week for that matter. We need to, as everybody's heard here, make better use of cell phone technology, and these numbers I can tell are out of date, but also make better use of a whole range of other technologies. But remember, technology itself solves nothing. It's the application that matters. And the key to that application is to look for change, not charity. We're big-hearted Americans. We like to give money overseas. We like to help people in need. But charity only demeans the recipient. Change gives dignity to both sides. So I thank you very much.